Sadly, this is a topic that no one would have ever thought there would be a need for or have even dreamed up just 6 months ago. And yet here we are. And this is a topic that I know has been of great importance and discussion, not only locally here in Asheville and Buncombe County, but all across the nation. Explore Asheville is very happy to provide this program for the benefit of our community and our many partners. And we have a large audience joining us today, and we're very grateful to those of you who have made time out of your busy schedule to do so. I want to thank you say thank you to all of you who continue to keep our restaurants, our accommodations, and our shops open while dealing with the many challenges presented by customers who won't mask up. I'm grateful to the owners and the workers who continue to offer hospitality to both visitors and residents, and those of you who continue to innovate and improvise every day to keep Asheville and Buncombe County up and running. I'm very pleased to introduce our guest speaker for this morning, Andria Ryan of the law firm Fisher Phillips. Andria is a partner in the Atlanta office and serves as co-chair of the Hospitality Industry Group. She represents employers in virtually every area of employment and labor law. Andria represents employers throughout the U.S. in defending employment discrimination and harassment cases, as well as handling traditional labor matters. She spends much of her time counseling employers in day-to-day employment and labor decisions and educating employers about prevention and practical solutions to workplace problems. She is a frequent speaker to industry groups and human resources professionals on numerous topics, including avoiding harassment in the workplace, proper interviewing, and effective discipline and discharge techniques. In 2007, she received a Chairman's Award from the Colorado Hotel and Lodging Association for her development of the Employment Compliance Guide for Colorado hospitality employers. She and Fisher Phillips have also been honored by the South Carolina Hospitality Association as Supplier of the Year and by the Washington Lodging Association for her valuable contributions by an allied member. She is AV peer review rated by Martindale-Hubbell, and she has become an expert on a topic that didn't exist 6 months ago, which is how to handle people who refuse to still mask up even during these times. So Andria, thank you for being here today. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. First, please put your questions in the chat box here on Zoom, and we will read them to Andria either during, and you can certainly don't have to wait till the end, or after the presentation. And then secondly, this webinar is being recorded for later viewing and will be posted to our website, AshevilleCVB.com. Now let's please give a warm Asheville welcome to our guest speaker, Andria Ryan. Andria, thank you again for being here today. And I should say too, you come very highly recommended by our good friend Lynn Minges at the North Carolina Restaurant and Lodging Association. I bet this is one subject that you never thought you'd be recognized as an expert on a few months ago, did you?
Chris, thank you. This subject didn't even exist a few months ago. Thank you all very much, Chris and your team, for inviting me. Thank you to the Explore Asheville folks. Thank you, Asheville CVB members, for welcoming me this morning. Chris, to your point, I've been practicing employment law for 30 plus years. And I feel like I've seen everything. You know, those of you that have employees know that anything can happen. And so, you know, a standard sex harassment case to the extreme. I had a client once that called me and said, we have an employee who's performing an exorcism in the lobby of our hotel. And when I got that call, I thought, I have seen it all. And I never would have said I would have been guiding my clients and employers through a worldwide pandemic. But here we are, and we're 6 months into a really, really challenging situation. So in addition to, thank you, Chris, for all the accolades. I do work very extensively in the hospitality industry, but I'm also on our COVID-19 task force. which is chaired by one of our North Carolina attorneys. So we have a great resources. And one of the later slides, I'll make sure you see where you can go sample forms, sampled letters, sample policies, and things like that. So we're happy to be staying in the forefront of this COVID issue. I partnered with a couple of my other attorneys on this issue, on this how to deal with anti-mask guests and visitors. And we have had more feedback from folks on this particular issue than almost every other one. And so it's obviously a problem. Now, there's been an uptick in confrontations, and I'm just giving you just a little sampling here of a few of them, just so we don't have to talk. If you've had one or two situations, I promise you're not on here. These are ones that really just showed up in the news. Everything from a Disney security guard being assaulted by a visitor when the security guard was enforcing the mask policy. It goes the other way, though. Remember, your employees can overreact. And so a Los Angeles grocery store suspended an employee after she pepper sprayed a customer who refused to wear a mask. I do not recommend that approach. We'll talk about some better approaches than that. Walmart employee as well punched a man during a confrontation. Walmart seems to find itself right in a lot of situations. Denver liquor store employee. So it's across the country. So we're seeing it, as you can see, east to west. I'll give you just a few more just to make yourself feel better that your situations can't be that bad. But Utica, Michigan man was arrested for punching a bartender and a manager in a restaurant in rage when they told him to wear a face mask or leave. A man who shot in Pennsylvania and stabbed a fellow customer who the two were shopping at a convenience store. And then a woman in Phoenix has been refused a flight and hit an employee from the airlines. So every industry, every walk of life around the country. I don't know, really all we can do is sort of, nobody's keeping track of these. Many of them are anecdotal. Many of them don't result in criminal penalties. Many of them are just, fly-by incidents. So I don't know how often it's happening, but when it does happen, it's getting a lot of press. And it's certainly something we don't want to happen in your place of business. And I think there's a lot of things we can do in advance to try to prevent that, many of which you probably already have in place. And maybe this is just going to give you some guidance to gear that up. So interestingly, as I was preparing for this webinar, the CDC issued guidance on this very issue. They said, they issued it on August 24th, and they basically recognized that they are recommending significant safety procedures for businesses, social distancing, limited capacity, including masks. And they recognized that the policies that they are recommending and that governors are implementing nationwide are resulting in employees, or may have resulting, or are resulting in employees being threatened and assaulted. So, a little bit of great insight here from the CDC on the dichotomy that they're creating for employers. Implement these strict measures, but we recognize that employees may be getting confronted by angry folks for a number of reasons. Interestingly, as I walked through the CDC's strategies, I thought, wow, this matches our 5-step plan somewhat. I mean, it's not exactly, but it gives us some good overviews, and it really does sort of mirror the 5-step plan that we've recommended for you. The CDC says offer customers options. I'm sure many of you have already thought about this or implemented it. I'm going to probably propose a few more you may not have thought of. Curbside delivery, designated shopping hours, after-hours shopping, curbside delivery of even goods and services, online shopping, all those. They recommend, just like I will, that you advertise your policies as much as possible. That doesn't mean somebody that's an anti-mask guest is going to appreciate it, but at least you'll have been upfront. Assess and respond to the potential violence. If you've got a particular guest or visitor that comes regularly that you have a problem with, let's start paying attention to our audience, I think, here. Provide training. I'm going to come back to this one, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time on it with you as well. Remain aware, and then I think very good advice that the CDC gives us that I'll close with today is support your employees and customers, obviously, but support your employees that end up with some sort of in some sort of confrontation. Think about this. We don't train our employees to de-escalate situations with their guests. Up until recently, we haven't had employees had to worry about anything more than a guest returns a meal because they didn't like it, or ask for a different room because they don't like the view in their room, or something's wrong with an item and they return it. Our employees are trained to process that system, but they really have not trained, or many of them are not really prepared for dealing with some of the anger that we're seeing in these situations. So let's walk through it. This is what I would call our 5-step action plan, and I'll go through each step with you. Number one, understand that you are permitted to require employees and visitors to wear masks. Your governor requires it, but for example, here in Georgia, the governor is not requiring it, which is a source of some controversy, as I'm sure you've heard. So even if you were in North Carolina, where it's required by your governor, you could have a policy, just a standalone policy, that requires your employees and visitors to wear masks. That's your right as a private employer. Step number 2 is be proactive about talking about your policy, putting your policy out there. Like I told you, step 3, it comes as number 3, but I think it's really one of the most important. Number 4, your legal obligation. You do have an obligation as a public accommodation to reasonably accommodate your visitors with medical conditions. Up until recently, that issue has been, as many of you know, ramps and elevators and access and pool lifts and issues like that. It's now become dealing with their medical conditions that may be associated with COVID-19. And then delicately deal with your visitors who refuse to comply. A few days after we wrote our article, someone else wrote an article, and it was a 5-step program to deal with anti-mask guests. And I thought, wow, what a novel idea, 5 steps. What disturbs me about the article, so some very good ideas in it, but what disturbed me about the article is much of it was very aggressive. It had step 4, figure out who your enforcer is going to be. And that disturbed me. And it talked about dealing with law enforcement very early on. And I said, you know, I'm hoping that dealing with law enforcement or having an enforcer for this policy is step 10 or 11 or 12 or 15 for you. I'm hoping step 5 will solve most of the problems that you're going to have with your guests, with issues. So let's talk about step 1. Just to be clear, it's private property. You can certainly, as long as you don't implement a discriminatory policy, you can implement any policy you want, and that policy can include masks. North Carolina obviously is giving you, the easy way out. You don't have to make your own decision. But for those that do, or for those of you that have businesses or are associated with businesses outside of the state, you certainly should and can and should include employees, contractors, visitors, vendors. And we need to keep in mind that we've got folks that visit our business that are not just employees and visitors. You can certainly do so with or without government mandate, as I've mentioned. And as you know, your governor has updated your restrictions as recently as yesterday. You didn't seem to change the mask provisions. He changed some others that you need to make yourself familiar with. But we're talking about masks today, and he doesn't seem to have made any changes at all with the mask requirements. One of the things I'm always going to tell you, and I'm going to suggest you train your employees on, is know what the law is. At least have 1 or 2 people in your organization that are experts on your executive orders. And certainly you want to rely on your CVB and your state associations. I know they're putting out information to you daily, I'm sure. But and that's great, because that's your source of information, but somebody needs to read it and stay up to date on it. So your particular North Carolina order requires businesses to have their patrons and employees wear face coverings. And the order defines what a face covering is, and it's pretty broad, and it talks about retail businesses and restaurants, hotel and lodging, personal care, grooming, tattoo parlors, transportation, plus many others. Very limited exceptions under the age of 2, some medical and behavioral concerns issues. We're going to come back to that one because it affects the issue I mentioned earlier, which is accommodating folks with potential disabilities. And others, for example, something that you may not have thought of is if I am a caretaker for someone who is hearing impaired and the person in my care reads lips and needs to see me to be able to speak, to understand, I may be exempt as the caregiver so that the person in my care can actually, use your services. So keep in mind that there are going to be some unusual exceptions that aren't that common for us. So make somebody in your organization a relative expert on your executive order and the changes as they come down. So now you've implemented your policy. Your retail and restaurants. You must post this. This is important. This is an important issue for you, and that is you must post the North Carolina required poster at the front entrance of your facility. There's more recommendations about providing masks and posting an employee at the entrance and all that. But what is important about this is if you're in compliance, if you implement the practices and the posting that the governor requires under his order, that you are deemed to be in compliance, even if a visitor doesn't do it, even if a visitor refuses to wear the mask.
Andrea, let me jump in there and ask a couple of questions that I'd like to elaborate. We've received. One question would be is, how do you define a mask? Does a face shield only count as a mask? And also, you may touch on this later, but what about people who wear masks but don't cover their nose?
Right. Well, the governor's order actually addresses that. It addresses that bandana type, although the CDC has had some issues, and we've seen some recent commentary on whether a neck covering that pulls up over your mouth is really an adequate covering. It seems to comply with the governor's order as long as it covers your nose and your face. So the governor's order actually says, this is not a proper mask. This is not a proper wearing of the mask. It needs to cover your nose all the way through to your chin. So the face shield is another area that's fairly controversial because they say that is really not adequate to do what a mask can do. But as you'll see in a slide or two coming up, face shields may be a good alternative to someone who can't wear a mask for perhaps a medical reason, because it's better than no mask or no covering at all.
But face shields would be considered to be legal, quote unquote, potentially.
Yes. Yes.
While we're talking about this issue of signage, a couple of attendees have asked a question regarding signage. One attendee has said, we post signs beginning at our parking lot right up to the entrance to the building about the need to wear signage. Are there recommendations as to specific language with regards to the signage? And is it required to use specific signage from, say, the Department of Health and Human Services, or can signs have the same message but different branding be allowed? And of course, we've all seen a lot of different variations on signage. What kinds of specifics should there be with regards to the language of the signage? And then secondly, how can we make sure that our signage is compliant so that our businesses are compliant?
That is a great question. And as you can imagine, this is not something that has been litigated. So, I'd love to be able to say there's 5 or 6 cases out there that say this is the exact signage you have to have. But there's not. Whether it'll be litigated sometime in the future is really up for discussion. But the governor has said in his order, there is specific language, and they have a sample sign that they'd like you to use. And then they say, if you're in compliance with our signage requirement, then you are not liable for a violation if the visitor refuses to wear a mask. Therefore, I think it's important that language, whether you use the exact signage, which is available on the website, or you incorporate that language into your own personalized signage, I think it's going to be important that you use the exact language.
Now,
and I'm a big fan, Chris. I'm a big fan of people, giving a pleasant, welcoming message about masks. So something like outside of our doors in our office, it says, "We're wearing a mask to protect you. Please wear one to protect us," which is a nice message. But then I think it would be important if we had a statute like North Carolina's order to have the exact governor's language.
Well, and to build upon that, the governor in his specific language yesterday of the phase 2.5, actually it's specified now that face shields will no longer meet the requirements for face coverings effective this Friday. So they are specifically being asked about, or specifically being saying now that face shields alone will not be sufficient beginning on Friday, and that face mask must be worn for any guest of ages 5 and older in the
Right.
new executive order.
Yeah, the face shields have been quite controversial, and I'm going to talk a little bit about them later as a potential alternative to the mask. But you're right. The agencies are telling us that they are not as they're not compliant. They're not going to be as protective as a mask covering, just like the bandana style as well. So it could be an alternative for someone who cannot wear a mask for a medical reason as a potential accommodation to their disability.
But and one other question too. I know that this is we see this in a number of places. Those folks who hold up a shirt or a T-shirt over their face, that they're wearing, and then hold it up as a quote unquote mask. I assume
right.
that specifically is not legal either.
That's not compliant either. And that's why I'd urge you, as the CDC does and the governor does, is to provide the mask right here. One of the recommendations they make is post an employee at the entrance, if you can afford to do that, and provide a guest. The disposable masks are readily available now and not terribly expensive. So, have it available and be prepared to hand it to the guest.
Well, we have some more specific questions coming in regarding specific cases of guests not wearing masks or not in compliance. I know you'll get to some of those later on, so we'll continue with your presentation.
Good. Let's see. We may be able to answer them as we move forward. Again, some of the advice I'm giving you is obviously somewhat self-evident, but sometimes I think when I put it in front of you and offer you some alternatives, you say, I hadn't really thought of that, and I might give that a try if you've been having some trouble. So be proactive with your mask policy. You want to be in compliance. You never want to be out of compliance with the governor's order. I mean, you certainly don't want to be that business, right? You don't want to ask your employees to do it. So post the required signage. Consider every possible avenue to advertise and give notice to your guests. If your guests have reservations, make sure it's in their confirmation for their reservation. Post a staff member at the entrance. I'm going to come back to your staff member at the entrance training in a moment, and then offer disposable masks. If someone's staying for an extended period, if you're a hotel or resort or in the lodging industry, have the guest acknowledge the policy when they sign in, that they're going to be required to wear a mask in all public areas, whenever they're outside their room, when they're traveling in and out of the hotel, in the parking lots. Have them sign some brief acknowledgement that they understand that that's your policy and agree to comply with it. So as proactive as you can. I told you I thought step number 3 was the most important, and I will continue to maintain that. I had this hit home the other day when I have a daughter in Boone, and she's a hostess at a restaurant. And she called me and sort of anecdotally told me about a family, children and 2 parents, who came in and refused to wear a mask. She's been on the job for 2 weeks. And she said, "Oh, it's terrible, Mom. I mean, the woman just stared at me and yelled at me and gritted her teeth. And it's, that's a horrible interaction for a young woman." And I said, "Well, what did you say to her? I mean, how did you try to handle it?" I'm thinking, I've got the perfect case study, right? And she said, "Well, I told her that the CDC recommends masks." I said, "Well, were you aware that the North Carolina governor is requiring it? I mean, there's basically a law that's not even just a recommendation." And she said, "Well, no, nobody's really told us that. It finally worked." She was really mad and eventually went to her car and got the mask. And I thought, this is exactly what I'm talking about when I say train your staff. Your front line employees, especially your young ones, are sort of winging it, just as my daughter did. And she did okay, but she had more tools she could have had more tools in her toolbox. I, of course, have given her the whole conversation. So I gave her a little training session on masks and how to deal with it, the North Carolina governor. I've also given her training sessions on sexual harassment, how to show up at work on time, what to say in an interview. So having an employment lawyer for a mother is good on one hand, but sometimes I'm afraid nobody will ever hire her if they know she has an employment mother that's an employment lawyer. But so far, so good. But I think it's really got set home for me was that she needed to know, and your frontline employees need to know, the details and the reason for your mask policy. They need to know, within reason, what the policy says and what's required and why. Make sure they're trained on not only that policy and the ordinance, but all of your healthy and safety measures, your social distancing, your cleaning protocols, your temperature taking protocols, whatever they are, so that if they're asked by a guest, asked by a government agency, asked by a visitor, what are you all doing to keep me safe and my children safe? They'll be able to say, 1, 2, 3, 4, here's the things that we're doing. So make sure they have that in their toolbox. I think you should give your employees a script about what to say to visitors and guests about their mask policy. Don't expect them to come up with something. It should be, thank you so much for coming to our restaurant, Ms. Brown. I'm happy to seat you, but we have a mask policy. I see you don't have one. Can I offer you one? Just something as simple as that. They shouldn't be told, do not have a discussion with, engage in, argue with a visitor that says, I don't think this is a good idea. I hate the governor. This is ridiculous. I'm an anti-masker. I'm an anti-vaxxer. I'm an anti-everythinger. There's no reason for your employee to get involved. What they should say to that guest is, we completely respect your opinion, but really we think it's better to be safe than sorry. Can I offer you the mask? And that's about it. So I think a simple script for your employees, and then if the visitor refuses, tell your employees what you want them to do about that. And they should not be addressing the next step. I strongly urge you to let a manager step in and take care of the next step, which is to confront your guests, to deal with your guests, to decide if they're going to stay or decide if they're going to go. Because I just don't think our employees, frontline employees, a hostess at a restaurant, a greeter, a valet parker, a bellman, I mean, they're just not, it's not what we train them to do. And we train them to be, visitor friendly, and we train them to be hospitable. And so we don't train them in de-escalation techniques. So I urge you to be very specific in your training and give your employees a script. And then designate 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 or however, based upon the size of your facility, which manager is going to deal with your non-compliant guests. We'll come back in step 5 to give you some pointers about that as well. Step 4, this is your legal obligation. You have a legal obligation to comply with the mask policy, but you also have a legal obligation under the federal law to reasonably accommodate your visitors if they have a medical condition. And that may be a medical condition that will not permit them to comply with the mask order. As I'm sure many of you know, the Americans with Disabilities Act, Title III, covers public accommodations. I presume all of you are on the webinar today are public accommodations. Most of the time, as I said, we're dealing with ramps and entrances and pool lifts and the things that allow your visitors and your guests to enjoy your property. Interestingly, it also requires you to accommodate visitors with disabilities that would prohibit them from wearing a mask. I've had some folks say, really, are there really people that can't wear a mask? And there are some people that cannot wear a mask. Their respiratory, their pulmonary issues. The most recent case I had was actually an employee, not a visitor, but an employee who said, I have post-traumatic stress disorder and I cannot I cannot work without anxiety with my face covered like this. I have flashbacks and I can't work. So now the question is, how can we accommodate that? Probably the first question you're asking is, in my third bullet is, well, can I ask them to prove that they have a medical condition? Well, you could. You have the right to do that. But it's very unlikely that your visitor will have medical documentation in their briefcase or their purse with them. If you were dealing with an employee that was asking for an accommodation, of course, you would ask for medical documentation of what their disability was, what their doctor recommends, what accommodation they need, and then you would work with the employee and discuss possible accommodations. That's not likely going to be available to you with a visitor. And I would suggest that if your stance is going to be, I'm not going to accommodate you until you prove you have medical documentation, you're going to have a guest relations issue on your hand. So I would suggest that you just accept the visitor's word for it and move on to the next step, which is considering the possible accommodations. Chris, you mentioned face shields earlier as an alternative to masks for someone that can't wear it. Again, if you have the signage, the proper signage posted, and the individual cannot wear or does not wear the mask, you don't have a violation. I mean, the employee may, or the visitor may get a citation, unlikely, but they may get a citation. But as a business owner, if you're doing what you're supposed to be doing under the executive order, that you should be okay. So I don't know that I would put someone out, but maybe you would have a few face shields that you can sanitize and offer to someone, you know, a little bit more expensive than a disposable mask. But you could say, we have a face shield available. Would you be willing to use it while you're here?
So Andrea, just to elaborate upon a couple of things on this particular issue, I know there's been some talk lately about religion as a possible exemption, a religious reason for as to being an exemption. Is religion covered as a possible reason for not being willing to wear a mask?
That's a good question. Not for your guests or visitors. For your employees, yes. Okay. Which is probably a topic for another day, because you have to, for your employees, you have to accommodate their disability, their pregnancy, and their religion. But for your guests, the only law that applies is Title III, which is a disability.
Oh, okay.
Now,
yeah, and certainly, I know there's been a viral message making the rounds of someone having printed out a religious exemption. So that sounds like that's for a guest, that's not applicable in this situation. Correct.
That's correct. So again, but if you get it from an employee, different story. We do need to talk about it, whether there can be a reasonable accommodation to allow them to practice if they have a truly, sincerely held religious belief about that.
We have another question along these lines where a guest or a contractor has claimed constitutional rights for not wearing a mask. What should the managerial response be to that? And again, we've certainly seen examples of that nationally as well.
And that is probably the most common complaint. I think I'm going to start to deal with it right here. Okay. Political constitutional objections. Number one, no one has, and this is a strange way to say this, but people don't have constitutional rights in your private business. People have constitutional rights again, with regard to government interference. You're not the government. So the state, the federal, the local government can't interfere with someone's rights if they even have them with regard to masks. But as a private employer, you can interfere with their political rights. Strange way to say it. Now, you are not required to accommodate constitutional, political, religious objections. That said, let's go back to the advice I was suggesting with your frontline employee, your hostess at the restaurant who's faced with someone with a political objection to masks. We need to have an answer to that. And we need to simply say, we are diverse. We celebrate diversity. We certainly appreciate your different points of view, but we're dedicated to the safety and health of our employees and our guests, and the governor's ordered this, and we're going to comply with that. We hope you will agree to do that, because we'd love to welcome you in. So something like that is a conversation that I suggest that a manager be having, or at least prepare your employees to have something. But we should not be debating. Our employees, we shouldn't expect them to debate that issue with our guests, because we're never going to win it.
Wanted to jump in here and say we will get to all the questions being asked, and this session is being recorded just as a reminder, and will be posted at AshevilleCVB.com following the session. To a couple of follow-up questions here. What about educational programs? We have someone asking a question about the question of educational programs regarding their adult students and whether or not they are still required to mask up if they're offering, say, an educational program?
I didn't study your governor's order with regard to that, so I mean, I'm not really sure that I'm the most qualified to answer it.
Yeah. And this is being done at a private. This is an educational program being done at a private business, potentially, and
like a training program,
right, or for adult students, continuing education programs.
Yeah, it seems to me. I mean, I saw no exemption for that kind of gathering. And so I think the mask requirement and the limitation on attendance would considered a public gathering.
Going back to the question about face shields, we've had the question earlier about face shields. So for someone who does have, say, a legitimate disability or health situation, a face shield would be, they could wear a face shield in those situations, correct?
It would be a reasonable accommodation to allow them to wear if they say, my doctor says I can wear this, but I can't wear a mask, better than no mask or no face covering, as long as it covers the nose and the mouth.
We have a couple of questions along this line also. Going back to the question where someone has an adult education program that they're doing in a theater, is virtual participation considered to be a reasonable accommodation for those adult students who are refusing to mask up?
I think so. I mean, I don't know the specifics about your program, but if we have to be in a position, and I'm glad you're asking this. It goes to my first bullet here. Some of these are very fact specific, and you don't want to find yourself in a class action lawsuit with a group of 20 or 30 or 40 people that say we can't attend this session because you're not accommodating our potential disability. And so remember, you have to accommodate their disability, not their unwillingness to wear a mask. So if you have a group of people that are just unwilling to wear a mask, if you want to virtually educate them, that sounds like a good alternative to me. But if you've got people who are disabled, who are unable to attend, that raises your level of responsibility. And what I would urge you to look at is, if I offer virtual learning for a disabled community or disabled guest or student, am I providing them substantially the same opportunity to be enriched by the program, versus just accommodating somebody because they won't wear a mask and we're just willing to let them log on virtually. Your obligation for a disabled patron is different, a little bit higher, a lot higher actually.
Here's an interesting question that's been posed. What about a situation where you have a business or a venue that's owned by a government body, but the in venue owned by a government body, but the user of that venue is a private business? Can they still require a mask without the constitutional debate? You talked about private business versus government, and could someone still require a mask for all their attendees if they're using a government venue, for instance, or if they're a business that's owned, if the brick and mortar business is owned by a government entity?
This sounds a little bit like a law school exam. Which is, this layer and this layer and this layer. But I'll give you what I think is a pretty good overview of that. Is if you're providing the service, the private company is providing the service, that's what the individual's paying for or contracting for, and that's their obligation. It's an agreement between the two of you, and you as a private employer have no obligation. If they have a beef with the requirement when they're on public property, they need to take it up with the government. So I would suggest to you, enforce your policy, enforce the governor's order and your policy, and tell them if they have a beef with this from constitutional grounds, they need to go talk to the owner of the building. But while they're here at your program, you're going to enforce the mask policy.
And one last question along these lines: Are guests required to wear masks at a private event if they're having it at a private business? If someone's having a private business, they've rented out a venue, they're within compliance around mass gatherings in terms of the numbers. But would they still, could you still require guests to wear masks at a private event on private property?
Yes. I mean, I don't think you can require them in their own home if you're hosting something in someone's own home. But if you're hosting something in as a private event on your property, yes. Okay. Yes, and should.
Hi, all. I'm going to jump in real quick. This is Kathy Peterson from Explore Asheville. We had a webinar on Monday with the wedding industry, and we did talk about that. And the Buncombe County Public Health people did say that if you're having an event at your house, in this case, it was a wedding event, you still have to follow all of those guidelines in terms of mass gathering, in terms of wearing a mask and social distancing and all of that.
Thanks, Kathy. It's got to be hard to have a wedding in the last 6 months. I could say that. I saw there's a lawsuit that's being filed, a class action lawsuit that's being filed in New York, I think, by the wedding, because their venues are not open, but restaurants are. And they're challenging the governor's order there on what's the difference between, if we follow all the guidelines, including masks and social distancing and limited capacity, what's the difference between us and a restaurant that has a more transient?
It's definitely very complex issues. And for anyone on the call, if you'd like to view that video from the webinar on Monday that answers some of those questions, you can go to ashevillecvb.com.
Yeah. Here's something else I'll offer. If anybody, if Kathy and Chris, we don't get to all the questions, or you feel like some of them might be a little too specific for a group discussion, my email is going to be available at the end of this, and I am perfectly willing, within reason, to try to answer any question you may have. If you need full-blown, legal advice or representation, we'll have to talk. But if you want to if we're unable to get to it and you want to shoot a quick question, what about this, Andrea? I'm happy to respond to you all. It's it's an evolving situation. So
thank you, Andrea. Appreciate it.
All right, and my step 5, and again, I will disagree with some colleagues out, not my own, but colleagues out there in the, that are speaking on this issue, is delicately deal with visitors who refuse to comply. I think it should be the very last resort that you're, removing somebody from your premises. You can, you should, certainly if they become violent or threaten violence. But if your frontline employee is not able to coax your visitor, and I use that word literally, coax your visitor into wearing a mask, they should involve a manager. But if you're the business owner, you need to let your manager know what you want them to do. So just because we've involved a manager doesn't solve the problem. Now, what is the manager going to do? So I recommend you, find a private location if you can, de-escalate the situation right away. Have a copy of the ordinance, have a portion of it highlighted, share your policy, remind them what's posted on the front door, and then question mark, do you want to contact security law enforcement? I mean, you may have to. At some point, they're trespassing. Are you going to allow the guest to enter? Certainly, I think there's a discussion about, if there's a medical situation that's prohibiting them from wearing the mask, what can we offer you? What alternatives can we do? But ultimately, the decision is, will you refuse to let them enter? We said in our article, never raise your voice, refrain from physical contact, do not take or force somebody to stay in a private location like a private office. I mean, we don't want to get sued for invasion of privacy or something like that. But this is a trespassing situation at some point. I would urge you to immediately document, whoever was involved in the incident, to immediately document the incident in an objective, non-emotional terms. Describe what happened, who was involved, what's the guest's name if you have it, when it happened, and what you did about it. Provide the documentation to whatever key personnel in your organization to preserve it in the event we have some sort of claim from that guest or complaint filed with local authorities, or somebody comes in to take a look at you for compliance issues. So I'm going to hope for you that you never have one of the incidences that were on my first 2 slides, because we're going to, again, you're in the hospitality industry for the most part, and that's what we do. We're hospitable. Well, you do. For some reason, I'm a lawyer, but I seem to have a an attraction to this industry, but you are, this is what we do for a living, and we should handle this one similar to every other complaint we get from guests. And so my final thoughts on this is, again, reminder, someone in your organization should be an expert on your local and state mandates and any changes. Periodically update your staff. Update them if you're doing any changes in your cleaning and health and safety protocols. Remember, these new health and safety protocols that we're implementing for COVID-19 are a policy. They're just like any other policy, your attendance policy, your safety policies, everything you've had for years and years. This is a new one. And you need to put it in place carefully, thoughtfully, and you need to enforce it. And that may mean discipline against your employees, just like you would discipline for other violations of your policy. I had a client call me recently, and they do temperature checks every day, and they have a couple of staff members in their spa that did not want to have the temperature taken. I don't know why. They didn't want to be bothered, is what it looked like. And they would just passive aggressively not go to the security office where they were supposed to have their temperature taken when they arrived, and they would just go straight to the spa. And it took a little while for people to realize, we're not getting a temperature check on these couple of employees. And when confronted, they said, we just didn't want to be bothered. And that's a policy violation. So make sure you keep your staff updated on any changes, get their acknowledgement and their understanding they have to agree with it, and then enforce it. My third bullet here is, I think, important. Be upfront with your employees about the fact that visitors may be upset. If you had an incident the evening before or the day before, say, listen, we had an incident with a customer yesterday. It wasn't terrible. It was, they raised their voice. Here's what we did. Just a reminder of what we expect from you all. This could happen to you. We don't want it to, but this could happen to you. Here's what we want you to do. Just periodically reinforce that. They're seeing it on social media anyway. They're seeing these confrontations. Everybody's posting them. And I thought a bit of advice, and that is use role-playing to teach employees how to de-escalate situations. We don't normally train frontline employees on this issue. Maybe having a lunch and learn where somebody role-plays an obnoxious visitor who rolls out every reason not to wear a mask, and see what your employees, teach what your employees how you'd like them to respond to some of those situations. I think maybe a good way to deal with preparing them for, unfortunately, the inevitable. So make sure your staff reports all incidents, no matter how small. I deal with this like I deal with workers' comp. Doesn't matter how small the injury. Tell us what happened. That visitor, that guest may come back. That visitor or guest, your employee might have thought it was a small incident, and they didn't. So the guest didn't, or the visitor didn't. So let's make sure you have their version early on. And then follow up with and support employees who are confronted by visitors. This is a disturbing thing. Interesting, I took my own experience again. My daughter came home and she called me immediately, and she wasn't upset. It was just, you could tell the encounter disturbed her. And she said, Mom, this woman just stared at me and said, I've already had the virus anyway, or just things like that. And it just was, it was just disturbing to her. And so, I'm hoping that her manager, and I followed up with her and the other employees involved in the incident and said, how y'all doing? And here's what we'll do the next time. So I urge you to do that, support your employees who might be confronted. So I'll get to your questions again right away, but we've got a very comprehensive resource center. Actually, I'll show you on the next page. If you go to our website, which is fisherphillips.com, and you subscribe, you'll get our alerts, and you will have access to, as I said before, the forms and sample letters to employees and contact tracing guidelines, and just a little bit of everything, including things specifically for the hospitality and retail industry. So I urge you to use those resources if you can. We also have a comprehensive FAQ on the coronavirus, which we update weekly. And I feel like somebody at the law firm staying up all night long reading CDC guidance. So it's not me, but somebody is, and providing us some really good day-to-day advice, which we're happy to pass along to you. So Chris, what have you got in the queue there?
Well, thank you, Andrea, very much. Just a reminder, too, we will be posting both the recording of this presentation and the presentation itself at ashevillecvb.com following the presentation. We've received several requests for the presentation and the tips that you've provided. Let's take a look at a few other things with regards to some of the questions we received. One question that we've received is representing a downsized theater. If the theater posts a sign that says, "Don't buy a ticket if you won't wear a mask, no refunds." Is that a sufficient position? Can you tell someone, don't bother buying a ticket if you're not going to wear a mask, and then don't offer refunds? I know that's a pretty specific situation, but what's the feeling about in terms of that kind of warning ahead of time?
I think I don't think there's anything under the law that would prohibit you from doing that. You can offer refunds at your discretion as a business. So I think you could do that. What I would be prepared for is somebody who gets overly anxious or expressive or angry about that situation. I'm not sure a refund, whatever the amount of the ticket is worth that kind of confrontation. So I would put that in the employee's toolbox as well, that if somebody becomes overly aggressive.
In the governor's most recent update yesterday, actually, for North Carolina, just to provide one clarification here, apparently the governor's order states that if a guest declines to wear a mask in accordance with the governor's mandate, they should not be asked to prove their exception, at least in North Carolina. So that's a clarification around the requirement to ask guests to provide a reason for their exception.
Yeah, I think it's important. I mean, I think that's what I was trying to express. I mean, we should just simply take their word for it. If they say I can't wear it for a medical reason, then we simply just say okay.
A couple of other questions that we've received with regards to some specific instances of guest situations where some of our attendees have run into. What about a public library? We have an attendee this morning from representing our public library system. They're not a private business. Do they follow the same recommendations that you have provided that are mostly geared toward private business?
Yeah, I think so. The governor's order is going to cover you. And so the governor's requiring you to have this policy. And so, I don't know that I want to get into the constitutional argument. If I'm the public library, you are part of the government system. So you're certainly subject to a constitutional challenge that a private employer isn't. But I would follow all of these guidelines and simply say, we're enforcing the governor's order, and do it as gently as you can, as recommended.
We have a representative from one of our lodging properties here in the area asking, or noting that they have guests coming in from different places with different states of mandates and reopening, and they offer masks to their guests if the guest appears not to be wearing one when they arrive. If they're not wearing a mask or refuse to wear a mask, can the hotel refuse to rent them a room, at least not wearing a mask in the public area?
Right. You can. And I think this is a challenge, obviously, because sometimes somebody will come in wearing a mask and they'll stand at your front desk and they'll check in and they'll acknowledge your policy and they'll see your sign. And then they're there for 3 days, and every time you see them coming through the lobby, they don't have a mask on. That's one observation. And so, the question is, do you want to intervene? Do you want to have a manager stop them one day as soon as they're seen and say, listen, we just wanted to remind you of our policy. You acknowledged it when you came in. We've noticed you haven't been wearing your mask. So we would please ask you to do so as soon as you're passing through the lobby. But yes, to the more specific question, if somebody stands at the front desk and says, I'm just not going to do it, I don't want your mask and I don't have my own and I'm not going to do it, it is perfectly reasonable to say, I'm not going to be able to check you in. I would refund whatever I would do what I can for them to be out your front door. So, if you can afford to do so, I would refund their money. I would reverse the reservation. I'd make arrangements. You can come back and we'd be happy to have you another time when the mask mandate is gone. We would welcome you back. Can we credit you to that visit? Whatever it takes, but you do not have to permit them to come in, and probably shouldn't.
Excellent. One other question to follow up too. I know in most places around the country, most restaurants that have been in a state of reopening are allowing guests to sit at the table and to eat their meals and to stay with their, to stay with their families or with their guests at that table while they're unmasked. That's generally, from a legal perspective, is that covered to allow a guest to remove their mask when either sitting, anticipating a meal, sitting, talking to their friends or family, and then, consuming food and beverage?
Right.
That's generally acceptable, correct?
It is acceptable. The question is, do you want to be on the stricter side? So some restaurants are saying, when you're interacting with our staff, we want you to put your mask back on. So when you're placing your order, and difficult to enforce, as you can imagine, but some restaurants are saying, when you're interacting with our staff, even when you're at the table, we'd ask you to put your mask back on.
So a restaurant potentially could require a guest to put their mask back on when they're interacting or engaging with an employee.
With an employee, yes. Again, kind of difficult to enforce, as you can imagine. A lot easier to enforce when they're walking through and when they sit at their table. And I think you'd actually be in the minority. I haven't done a survey, but I will say it seems anecdotally that you would be in the minority if you were to require that, but you could.
And one last question, just to follow up on something I asked earlier, I may have elaborated upon it in detail. The person who just holds up their T-shirt as a mask, a business can tell that person that that's not an acceptable face covering. Is that correct?
Correct.
Very good. Well, Andrea,
Chris, let me just point to you. For those of you who are having any question about that, if you look at the governor's definition of face covering, it is secured to the head. It's a covering of the mouth and nose that is secured to the head with ties, straps, or loops over the ears, or is wrapped around the lower face, presumably here. So if you need to remind your guests, have a copy of that order with you.
Gotcha. So one last point of clarification from one of our attendees this morning. Are you saying that if the guest says they have a medical reason for not wearing a mask, you're recommending not to argue or confront them and let them come in, just try to offer them an alternative to that?
You would be required to offer them to try to reasonably accommodate them. So accept their medical condition, don't argue about that, and then just simply say, is there an alternative? Try everything before letting them come in without a mask. I mean, that is an alternative, but it should be the last alternative. As a face shield, a reasonable alternative that you can handle. Can we do curbside service for you? Can we invite you to come, after hours to visit our store? Explore other options before allowing them in without a mask. Should be the last.
Very good. Well, again, thank you very much for your time today. Your contact information there is on the screen. And again, this will be posted at AshevilleCVB.com along both the presentation and the recording. You've been very generous today with your time, Andria. We are in great debt to you. And also appreciate your sending your daughter to live and work in the North Carolina mountains.
Beautiful Boone, North Carolina. Yes.
Thank you.
Well, thank you to you all and to your team, Chris.
Well, we appreciate it. Stay safe, stay sane, everyone, and hopefully we'll see you soon.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye.